1 week ago, I got the 600 ohm Beyerdynamic DT880. It is my first 880. I had read many mixed reviews about the 770, 880, and 990. They have their fans and detractors. Some people said that the 880 was a more tame 990 without the 770's bass. Then, a particular reviewer on YouTube made some interesting comments about the 600 ohm 880. That person stated that this headphone requires an absurd amount of power. And that was the clincher. I took a chance on the 600 ohm DT880. I wanted to confirm how much power these headphones would require, and I wanted to provide information that the other reviewer did not. This video is going to be limited to the 880's power requirement. I will very briefly talk about the sound signature first. The reason I'm doing this is because the issue of the power requirement is paramount. I will compare the DT880 to other headphones in other videos. This is going to be somewhat long, but if you are at all interested in the power requirements of the 880, you should watch this video in its entirety. I know that's tough for a lot of people, but if you clicked on this video, then do yourself a favor and watch the entire analysis. When we buy gear, we all have certain expectations. Sometimes our expectations are met, and other times we are very disappointed. I was not disappointed with the DT880. I am a huge fan of this headphone from the moment I put it on my head. There is so much to like about the sound and comfort of the 880. I purchased the special edition version. It was refurbished with a 90-day warranty from Amazon. It was the same price as the standard version, but I like the looks of the special edition. I like the black matte finish and the covered headband area. The standard version has two metal pieces exposed just above the ear cups, and they look like horns, which I really dislike. Someone commented that the special edition has different sound tuning. I don't know if this is true, and I certainly didn't see anything on Beyerdynamic's website that would corroborate this. As far as I know, the special edition are limited edition headphones in a different physical design only. In all other respects, the 600 ohm special edition is exactly the same as the standard version, as far as I can tell. These headphones are, as I said, 600 ohms with an SPL of 96 decibels and a power handling capacity of 100 milliwatts. The 600 ohm 880 is truly a masterful headphone. It has above average soundstage to wide soundstage. It has clear mids and a very well extended treble. The treble is not harsh or distorted. The bass is fast and on the neutral side. There is a bass extension into the sub-bass, but that sound is somewhat muddy. The sub-bass and mid-bass tend to meld a little, however, the mids remain largely unaffected. These are not bass head headphones. If you like deep rumble and subwoofer effects, you need to look elsewhere. If you want accurate bass, this is an excellent place to stop. The 880 is very comfortable. I love the plush ear pads, I love the padded headband, and the clamping force is perfect. I was very critical of the DT1770's vice-like clamp, but the 880 is as far away from that as possible. The headphones nestle my head. I can easily wear the headphones for several hours without fatigue. This also means that the sound is not fatiguing. There are some headphones which are physically comfortable, but whose sound signature gets far too difficult to enjoy for more than short periods. The Modhouse Argon is a good example. Then there are headphones which sound amazing, but the physical design makes it hard to use. The Bass Audio G12 is a perfect example. Without a pad change, the G12 can be hard to use for prolonged periods. But the 880 is the right combo. It has excellent padding, excellent, accurate, yet fatigue-free sound. Bottom line, and generally speaking, I think the 600 ohm 880 has above average soundstage, accurate bass with clear vocals, and above average treble extension without harshness. The 880 also has above average detail retrieval. A certain $400 audeze headphone can't compete in many respects with this sub-$200 comparatively ancient headphone. As I said before, a more thorough sound review will be in other videos. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the power requirements for this headphone. Off the bat, let's be clear. The 600 ohm DT880 does not require the idiot level power a particular reviewer is advocating. That particular reviewer's recommendation is dangerous and outrageous. I'm going to break down my testing. I found the results very interesting. There were several questions I needed to answer. First, what does not drive the 880? Second, what drives the 880 to ear-piercing level? Third, what power output is acceptable for the 880? In other words, do you need the most powerful amplifier to drive the 880, or do lower-powered amps work? Fourth, do I hear any audible difference in performance as I move from one amplifier to the next? And finally, can I explain the differences in sound if there are any differences to begin with? This test has to assume a few factors. First, I have to assume that Beyerdynamic intended the 880 to be used only through single-ended connection. I assume this is correct since there has never been a balanced version of the 880 from Beyerdynamic, despite the fact that this headphone has been in the market since 1980. Second, I have to assume that Beyerdynamic aimed this particular headphone for professional use. This seems to be true considering how hard it is to drive the headphones. This assumption leads to the further assumption that mobile devices are not appropriate for the headphones, and you will need a dedicated amplifier. Based upon this, I will limit my test in this video to desktop amplifiers. And the last assumption I have to make is that Beyerdynamic never intended this headphone to require a nuclear power plant such as what a certain reviewer is advocating. There is circumstantial and direct evidence of this. Search for headphone amplifiers that have 1 watt of output power for 600 ohm load in single-ended connection. You'll find 1 or 2. Moreover, I spoke with Beyerdynamic for amp suggestions for the 600 ohm 880. What I was told further reinforces my assumption that the 880 was not intended to be used with insane level amps. I tested the 880 on 9 amplifiers. I used the Drop 789, Audio GD 1A, KN IHA 6, Magni Heresy, Monolith Liquid Spark, Lyre, Iyun X7S, Beyerdynamic A2, and Beyerdynamic A20. Mobile devices, including DAPs, cannot drive the 880. Just forget that. The results I got were seemingly inconsistent at first, but when I put all the numbers on a spreadsheet and reviewed my notes, it became clear. Very clear indeed. Here's the short version. Anyone who believes that you need 50 watts of power from the Emotiva Bass X to drive the 880 is certifiably nuts. Moreover, anyone who proposes that people should stack amps to get greater and greater amplification should be completely ignored. Let's talk about the individual tests. These tests were conducted using Amazon Music HD. I played exactly the same tracks over and over again. These tracks were a combination of pop and hip-hop. This provides a fairly good representation of the entire frequency range. Obviously, some of these amplifiers have balanced output. I use only the single-ended connections. I first plugged the 880 into the 789. It can easily drive the 880 on high gain with the volume at 3 o'clock, but the bass sounds a little rolled off. There's some impact, but there's a lack of detail. There was sub-bass and mid-bass melding. The mids were clear and neutral, and the treble had a very slight emphasis. There was plenty of volume adjustment left. However, at 3 o'clock, the headphones were beyond safe listening volume for me. I switched to the 1A. It has 80 milliwatts more output power than the 789 on single-ended connection. On high gain and volume set to about 140, the 880 got plenty loud. The bass, however, was very loose. It was muddy and distorted. The mids were quite veiled. I switched back to the 789 and confirmed that the 789 had a cleaner presentation. However, the 1A produced a significant amount of rumble, the type that the 789 was simply missing. I next went to the KN IHA 6. I plugged into the high impedance jack with the voltage at low. I heard deep sub-bass rumble, bass slam, and impact, clear mids, and detail. I switched to the low impedance jack and the sound became more muddled. The bass had more rumble and longer decay. The mids were slightly recessed. The difference was obvious going back and forth between these two quarter-inch jacks. The high impedance jack resulted in tighter bass with more detail all around. I switched back and forth between low voltage and normal voltage. There was a slight difference, which was mostly in the decay of the bass. It is very difficult to describe the alterations here, and they were fairly minor. I then switched to the Magni Heresy on high gain. It easily got the headphones loud, but I heard fairly loose bass, rumble, and no bass definition. The bass bled into the mids. Details overall were lost and the 880 sounded flatter than on the previous amps. I switched back to the iHa6 to check, and it was confirmed. I then moved to the Liquid Spark. On normal gain, the 880 got plenty loud at around 3 o'clock on the volume knob. In fact, it was a little too loud. The bass was bloated, but the mids were still audible. There was a melding between the bass and mids. There was no real bass definition. When I switched to high gain, the bass tightened up immediately. It was not nearly as bloated. There was better bass slam, though separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was missing. The vocals became clearer on high gain. I next switched to the shit lyre with its stock tube. I heard sub-bass rumble and bass impact. There was obvious melding in the bass and from the bass into the mids. The presentation was notably more clear and textured than it was on the Heresy. Obviously, the lyre got the headphones loud with room to spare. Compared to the iHa6, the lyre combo sounded a little muddy. The bass was not as detailed as on the iHa6. I wanted to check on a Class A amplifier. I therefore plugged the 880 into the iUn X7S. I had it connected via RCA to the Modi. I believe the X7S has 250 milliwatts at 300 ohms from RCA connection. How much power it outputs at double the load is, frankly, anybody's guess. Maybe it's 150 milliwatts or less or more. Before I used the amp, I made sure to increase the gain to plus 20 decibels using the dip switches on the bottom. There is plenty of volume to drive the 880. With the volume knob at 12 o'clock, the headphones got to very comfortable loudness. At 2 o'clock, the volume was beyond recommended listening volume. The X7S is a clean Class A amp. Increasing volume didn't change the sound, it just made it louder. What I heard was slight sub-bass rumble that melded a bit with the mid-bass. Vocals were clear. Bass slam was present but sounded a little blunted compared to the lyre and the iHa6. I then switched to the Beyerdynamic A2. When I spoke to Beyer, they recommended the A2 to pair with the 880. Of course, I figured they were trying to upsell me, but I already had the amp. I was very surprised. The A2 had sub-bass rumble, bass slam, clarity, excellent separation between the bass and mids, and got the 880 plenty loud with some room to spare. This was odd, since the A2 has among the lowest power output numbers of the amps I tested. I finally ended my journey on the Beyerdynamic A20. This is the younger brother of the A2. It's less fancy, but has similar specs. The A20 was able to very easily drive the 880. At 12 o'clock on the volume dial, the headphones were at the peak recommended volume. At 2 o'clock, it was far too loud for safe listening. I heard sub-bass rumble that was fast and separate from the mid-bass. There was bass slam and detail. The vocals were clear and unaffected by the bass. I switched back to the X7S and listened. There was a notable difference. The X7S sounded more veiled, more muddy. The difference was apparent. On some tracks, the difference was night and day, whereas others it was slight. Nonetheless, each song was clearer on the A20 with more bass definition and accuracy. Here are my impressions of each amplifier. The 789 clearly has power for the 880. That isn't the issue. The issue is the weak bass response. The overall sound was mostly clear and undistorted. The 1 amp had a fairly poor sound reproduction. It was able to get the sub-bass rumble I thought was missing from the 789, but it was simply bloated. It had no definition. The bass melded with the mids and distorted the vocals. Of all the amp pairings, this was without doubt the worst. The iHa6 had both the sub-bass rumble and bass impact that I wanted. The frequency range was clear, undistorted, and precise. It was a huge difference from the previous amps. The Heresy performed a little bit better than the 1 amp, but its bass presentation was similar to the 1 amp. The bass was bloated. However, where the 1 amp had distorted mids, the Heresy's mids were seemingly recessed. The Liquid Spark is still an amazing amp for $100. It is able to drive every headphone any reasonable person would want. The Liquid Spark got the 880 plenty loud. There was bass rumble, but that rumble melded with the bit bass. It was very similar to the Heresy's performance. However, whereas the Heresy had slightly recessed mids, the Liquid Spark seemed to keep the mids fairly neutral. Between the Heresy and Liquid Spark, I would say that the Liquid Spark and 880 combo sounded livelier. The shit lyre seemed to have a fairly good combo of bass rumble and impact. The bass melded with the mids, but that's what you get with a hybrid amp. Still, I was missing detail and clarity. Even though the lyre is a hybrid, the tube integration adjusts the sound and doesn't really make a huge difference. The X7S is plenty powerful. We had to guess about the power output for the 880, but it didn't really matter. The 880 gets far too loud for safe listening, and there's still room left if you're really hard of hearing. This combo had sub-bass rumble that sounded slightly bloated. It was hard to differentiate between sub-bass and mid-bass. The vocals remained fairly clear. However, some melding between the bass and mids did occur. The X7S provided some bass slam, but compared to the Beyerdynamic amps, sounded veiled. I was most surprised with the A2. Its power output is the same as the 789 on paper, but the sound could not be more different. It was similar to the sound from the IHA6, but the bass had slightly more definition, better separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, clear vocals that sounded neutral, and detail throughout. I was equally surprised with the A20 as I was with the A2. As I said before, these amps share specs. These aren't the most powerful amplifiers around. In fact, many would laugh at the numbers for these amps. But I've learned that measured numbers are just a small part of the story. The A20 Sound Performance is very, very close to the A2. I think the A2 had slightly stronger bass slam and slightly better separation between the sub-bass and mid-bass. The differences were audible, but it wasn't a huge leap. In fact, it was pretty minor. You could easily confuse the two amps in this test. While using the 9 amplifiers, I heard 2 different sound signatures. The first sound signature is mostly clear mids and vocals with sub-bass rumble that is either bloated or a little rolled off. The bass lacks detail and definition. There is some bass and mids melding. Bass slam is mostly missing, and when present, sounds blunted. The second sound signature has sub-bass rumble, deep sub-bass reproduction. There is a sub-bass and mid-bass separation. The mids are clear and separate from the bass. There is excellent treble extension. Compared to the first sound signature, the second sound signature appears accurate and fast. The first sound signature sounds veiled in comparison. There's no right answer. You can enjoy either of these 2 sound signatures. If you want my opinion, however, I personally prefer the second sound signature, the one with the cleaner, more defined bass response. For purposes of this video and for ease, I'll refer to this second sound signature as the better one. Some people claim that you need a certifiable power plant to drive the 600 ohm 880. That is rubbish. The power output numbers for each amp at a load of 600 ohms is the following. The 789 is 100 milliwatts. The 1 amp has 180 milliwatts. I achieved this by actually talking to Audio GD. They informed me that the single-ended output has 30% of the power output of the balanced. The IHA6 has 2.2 watts on low current into 32 ohms, so frankly, it's anybody's guess, and likely it's pretty low, around the 100 to 200 milliwatt number. The Shit Heresy has 215 milliwatts. The Liquid Spark, well, there's no official measurement for the 600 ohm load, but one reviewer said that it is 90 milliwatts. The Shit Lyre has 450 milliwatts. The Iyun X7S has 250 milliwatts at 300 ohms and unknown number for 600 ohms. The Beyerdynamic A2 is 100 milliwatts, and the Beyerdynamic A20 is 100 milliwatts. So, why was I getting, quote, better performance from the A2, A20, and IHA6? I'm guessing at the IHA6's power output, but it's probably somewhere close to what I said. Why weren't these amps performing just like or worse than the 1 amp, Heresy, Liquid Spark, Lyre, X7S? Why did the 789, which has the same power output as the A2 and A20, have a strikingly different sound? Why was it that the 789 made the bass sound rolled off, lacking sub-bass rumble, and did not sound as full as the A2 and A20? If power is the issue, then I should have heard a significant difference. And I did, but not the way that one would think. Greater power doesn't mean better performance. In fact, the lowest power devices had a night and day difference and better for the 880. Why? I decided to think of it in terms of damping factor and impedance matching. This hasn't been a big deal at all before. The vast majority of our headphones will work just fine with nearly any amp. I read NWAV Guy's blog on the issue. I reviewed Tyle Hertzon's comments. I read Bayer's spec sheets and thought about the tests I did. And I'm fairly sure the issue is with damping factor and output impedance. I could be wrong, of course, but it's really hard to come up with a different explanation that fits the test results. I checked the output impedance for each amp. That started to put things into perspective. And here are the numbers. Here's the 789. It's less than 0.05 ohm on single-ended and less than 0.1 ohm on balanced. Of course, ASR measured the balanced output impedance at 1 ohm. The 1 amp has 1 ohm output impedance. Audio GD has a bad habit of not providing full specs, so I don't know if this is for single-ended or balanced or both. Considering they didn't bother to state the power output of the single-ended, we can assume that the output impedance mentioned is for balanced. The IHA6 has a 10 ohm output impedance for the low impedance headphone jack and 120 ohm for the high impedance jack. The Shit Heresy has 0.25 ohm output impedance. The Liquid Spark has less than 0.1 ohm. The Shit Liar has 0.3 ohms. The X7S, well, ASR measured it at 11 ohms, but Iyun doesn't say. The Beyerdynamic A2, it can either be switched between 0 ohms or 100 ohms. And finally, the Beyerdynamic A20 has 100 ohms fixed. The amps that allowed the 880 to perform the best were the ones with significantly higher output impedance. This, even though that the power output for the IHA6, the A2, and the A20 are significantly lower than the other amplifiers. Interesting, isn't it? Damping factor is typically calculated in the rule of 1/8. It's not set in stone, but it is an excellent rule of thumb that works more often than not. We can easily calculate the damping factor for the 600 ohm DT880. All you have to do is divide 600 by 8. The proper output impedance based upon the damping factor is 75 ohms. That is, you divide 600 by 8. Well, none of the powerful amplifiers came anywhere close to this. The only amps that do also uncoincidentally helped the 880 perform notably better. Should the amplifier output impedance be as low as possible? Yes, for normal headphones, but very high impedance headphones have different character and different requirements. The low output impedance amps all had essentially the same sound profile. There were some variations here and there, but not by much. The amps with the highest output impedance provided what I call the better performance. This is not coincidental. Output impedance has much to do with proper pairing. New audiophiles don't know about output impedance. Those who are easily drawn to the hyped product of the week either don't pay attention or don't know. And the hype men don't talk about damping factor and output impedance at all. That is a shame. True, often it doesn't make a difference. If you buy the 300 ohm HD600 and plug it into Shit Magni or Liquid Spark, you'll be very happy. The sound is good to you, and damping factor is of little relevance. Can you get improved performance with higher output impedance on the HD600 or similar headphones? Maybe. Maybe you'll like the higher output impedance and maybe you won't, but that's your personal preference. The general understanding is that you should aim for the lowest output impedance possible from an amplifier. But some headphones, particularly those designed with purpose, will respond much better with high output impedance amps. Insufficient damping results in boomy bass. There will be a lack of bass texture and detail. Moreover, bass will bleed into the mids. When you see a high impedance headphone, you need to ask yourself what the headphone output impedance should be. And if the manufacturer of the amplifier does not say, you have to ask them. If the manufacturer of the headphone does not say, ask them as well. This is different from headphones that are just hard to drive. There may be low impedance headphones whose SPL is too small. That would not mean that you need an amp with high output impedance. In other words, some headphones just need lots of gain and power. And then there are the niche headphones, like the Beyerdynamic. I have to mention Zeos's 880 review. Maybe I misunderstood, but I think he had amps stacked to power the 880. He mentioned the Geshelli pushing on high gain into the 789, which was also set to high gain. He then later talked about the Emotiva Bass X A100, and he pushed that amplifier like it was the new street drug. Well, I think this is all wrong. He's treating all of this like more gain equals better performance. That's not the only factor, and it is incredibly foolish to think more power is all that it takes. It's the Tim the Toolman Taylor version of headphone pairings. Emotiva never provided the output impedance for the headphone jack on their amplifier. Someone on hifi said it's 220 ohms with the jumpers installed. The post mentioned modifying the internals to get lower impedance. I don't know if 220 ohms is accurate, but that's the only info I have. And it's huge. I mean, it's stupid. But then again, it's no less stupid than having a headphone amp with 50 watts of power. I cannot emphasize how idiotic Zeos's recommendation is. It is dangerous. Forget the possible hearing loss you'll experience if you accidentally bump the A100's knob. Think about the drivers. All headphones have a max power handling limit. We break this warning all the time. Beyer says that the 880's max limit is 100 milliwatts, and cautions against spending too much time with an amp that provides more than the rated power handling capacity. The A100 provides between 50 watts and some unknown number. That's a giant leap. But it's foolish to assume that the A100's power at 600 ohm load will be anything close to 100 milliwatts. Regular use of your headphones on the A100 is going to destroy the drivers. There's no doubt about it. It will happen eventually. It is certifiably insane for Zeos to push the A100. Thankfully, the amp is not available any longer and it's hard to find. But he's still advocating the more power is more gooder ideology. The question is this: can the 600 ohm DT880 be driven by something less than the nuclear power plant that Zeos keeps in his basement? The answer is yes, of course. You'll need an amplifier of modest specifications. Every single amplifier I tested easily drove the 880. The sound signature was different depending on the output impedance. Let's pose another question. Would a really powerful amplifier with low output impedance sound the same as a low-powered amp that has high output impedance? Well, it's hypothetically possible. You could force the drivers to do your will with sheer blunt force, but there are issues. First, it's very difficult to find an amp with exceedingly high power output for the single-ended connection. You can certainly modify the 880 for balanced connection, but that's extra money and time. Second, higher power output means that the life of your headphone drivers is going to be shorter. This is one reason why headphone warranties specify that the warranty covers nominal performance. If your drivers die because you decided to pump 500 milliwatts into the 880, you are at fault. Third, you're unlikely to get the same performance as you would with a proper amp match. Maybe you'll get close, but like I said, at the cost of the headphone drivers. Here's another question. Why do you need the 600 ohm version? Unless you think it will provide what you need in your studio, what's the purpose? Maybe it's the typical nonsensical hype. Look, Tyle Hertzens already spoke about this. No matter what you think of me or Zeus or anybody else, Tyle was a straightforward shooter. He compared the various versions of the 880. He said the sweet spot is frankly the 250 ohm. The 600 ohm has slightly better performance, but it's not by much. Sure, you can get the 600 ohm headphone and do whatever you want, but there's a reason why the 250 ohm version exists. If you don't have the correct equipment for the 600 ohm headphone, then just skip it. Don't bend over backwards modifying a speaker amp, daisy chaining amps, and don't spend more money on balanced modifications. There's so much misinformation about audio products that it's nearly impossible to get a straight answer. There's no such thing as a perfect headphone or the best headphone amp. When you ask what's the best, you leave yourself open to be fooled. Certain reviewers will tell you exactly what you want to hear. Ask that person the best recommendation today and you'll get one answer. Ask that person the same question a month from now and you'll get a completely different answer. Ask that person what's the best amplifier for the 880 and you'll get an absurd answer. That person's supporters will barf out the same nonsense. Here's a simple rule of thumb. If the answer to your question involves a nuclear reactor for amplification, it's probably the wrong answer. The A2 and A20 have an output impedance that is closest to the output impedance we calculated. The IHA6 follows after that. And then that's it. Nothing else comes close, even remotely. Somebody could say that this is all in my imagination, but I didn't make up damping factor, output impedance, and power handling. Tile and NWAV guy already talked about this. Neither of them said that more power is what you need. In fact, if you look at Tile's comparisons of the various impedances for the 880, you'll notice he didn't say anything similar to what Zeo says. Here is what you need to know. If you intend to buy the 600 ohm DT880, keep in mind you will need an amplifier with high output impedance to control the driver's performance. This is how Beyerdynamic designed the headphones. You might be able to find old amps that have high output impedance. Modern amps, for the most part, aim for 1 ohm or less. If you do not have a high output impedance amp, but want the 600 ohm 880, then you can still enjoy the headphones. The Liquid Spark does just fine. The Heresy also performs okay, though the bass bloat might bother you. You can likely get slightly better performance out of the Balanced on the 789. Just be mindful that you're merely compensating the lack of proper output impedance with sheer power. That will have a toll on the headphones eventually. And if you are interested in getting a high impedance amp, you don't need to spend thousands of dollars. The Beyerdynamic A20 does the job perfectly. It's currently about $350 to $375 on Amazon. Mind you, this amplifier was designed for high impedance headphones, and it's quite the indulgence if you have only one 600 ohm headphone in your collection. Whichever amplifier you choose, I can say that the 880 sounds good. You can get tighter, more accurate presentation depending on the type of amp you use. My subjective opinion is that the 880 sounds great with 8 out of the 9 amps I tested. The 1 amp is a good amplifier, but in this circumstance, it simply doesn't match with the headphones. So, if you have an amp like the Liquid Spark or Heresy or 789, you don't need anything more to drive the 880. Single-ended works fine. If you're curious whether Balanced will increase performance, you can have the headphones modded. I suspect the difference will be slight depending on the amplifier. In future videos, we'll talk about the 880's sound signature in more detail and conduct comparisons with other headphones.